Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another in our series of video chats aimed at the Half Earth Project educator ambassadors. As you know from previous ones, that one of the nice things we do is occasionally get some authors to join us. There's some really great books out there on the topic of conservation, ecology, understanding, saving biodiversity. And so today I'm super pleased to have Ben Goldfarb joining me. Hi, Ben. How are you doing?
Hey, Dennis. How are you?
Good. And Ben lives in Spokane, Washington, so it's morning time for him. And this is the book that we're going to talk about in part. We're going to hopefully get to know Ben a little bit. And the book's called Eager: The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. And this book, I think, has done really well for you, Ben. It's gotten a lot of well-deserved recognition. That, of course, matters. What really matters is I actually read it and I love it.
Yeah, I grew up in New York. I'm really fortunate to have parents who always fostered time outside. They took me hiking and camping. I loved to fish from a very young age. So
New York State or New York City?
A suburb of
Yeah.
New York City, yeah. So the Hudson Valley,
Uh-huh.
I just always loved to be outside. Cared deeply about nature and wildlife in particular, and always loved to write as well. And just really fortunate that I found myself in a situation where I could kind of combine those two passions. So I went to graduate school. I have a master's in environmental management from the Yale School of Forestry, and I went there, sort of thinking that I was going to go, work for a foundation like yours, or the Nature Conservancy or the World Wildlife Fund, one of the big NGOs. And then when I was in graduate school, I just found myself sort of remembering that I loved to write, and started writing for various campus publications, and realized that that environmental journalism was the best way that I could combine my passions and my skills to help the planet, basically.
Yeah.
So so I ended up working for a magazine called High Country News out in Colorado.
Oh,
Worked
yeah.
for those guys for a couple of years. Started freelancing for other publications, and that eventually led me to this book.
Oh, that's terrific. So was landing a writing gig with High Country News, was that kind of a breakthrough for you for your career?
Yeah, I think that was really formative. At that point, I was still in my mid 20s, and I really had basically no journalism experience. I knew that I loved to write, but I didn't really know what it meant to be a professional writer at that point. And spending time in the High Country News office, and then going out to be a sort of a field correspondent for them was really formative. I got to spend time with professional journalists and understand what it truly means to make a living writing about the planet. My master's program was I took a lot of ecology classes, so I consider myself. Certainly I'm not absolutely not a scientist. I know Ed Wilson would would frown upon me if we try to talk about evolution. He's probably a pretty forgiving guy.
Yes, and he'd be one of Ed's key things is follow your passion, for sure. So I think Ed would love to hear your story. Yeah.
Good. Well, anyway, so I'm certainly not a scientist, but I do have a background in the sciences, especially ecology, which is certainly very, very valuable when you write about wildlife conservation and conservation biology. And in graduate school, I also took various hydrology classes, stream restoration classes. I had a lot of sort of hydrological education as well that was really valuable when you write about a creature like the beaver that changes aquatic ecosystems so profoundly. So there's no question that my grad education was hugely helpful in being a journalist and also writing this book.
Yeah, help you ask the right question, help frame your thinking on things, probably help you communicate with the scientists you need to interview when you interview.
Absolutely, yeah, and it just helps me sort of interpret their papers, right? There are hundreds of citations in the book, and certainly being reasonably well versed in these fields helps me make sense of the scientific literature that I read.
Yep. Well, I really like that about the book. There's a lot of depth. I like this. I like your story because um, it does a really good job of balancing. There's so many interesting characters, meaning the people in it. The beavers themselves are, of course, amazing and important. And so I really appreciate that, combining the human stories with the ecology and the nature aspect of that.
Yeah, good. That was, that was one of the things that was so striking for me when I embarked on this project, was just how many people out there were just insanely passionate about
Yeah,
beavers. And I think that's, certainly there are other species that inspire that kind of emotion, wolves and bears, but there aren't that many,
right.
that have this incredible coalition of people who are so deeply devoted to their restoration. So
Yeah.
I think that's one of the really amazing things about beavers, is their ability to attract all of these different characters from all of these different fields, all working on a single rodent. I think that's really cool.
How many beaver species are there in the world?
Yeah, so there are only two beaver
Yeah,
species
only
these days.
two.
Only two. Yeah, there's
Huh.
Castor canadensis. That's the North American beaver, which lives in North America, of course, from kind of the tundra line up in Canada and Alaska to as far south as northern Mexico. And then there's Castor fiber, the Eurasian beaver,
Mhm.
which lives in Europe and Asia, and was historically distributed, as far as the Korean Peninsula. I mean, real beavers were really all over the place in Europe and Asia, and now they're slowly coming back after nearly being wiped out. So
Yeah.
we've only got two beaver species, although historically, sort of
In right.
prehistoric times, there were
Yeah.
many dozens of different genera of beavers. There were beavers. There was of course the famous Castoroides beaver. That was the sort of the giant, almost black bear sized beaver that lived in North America. There was a kind of a prairie dog like beaver that dug these amazing sort of spiral burrows that I describe in the book. So
Yeah.
there was once incredible beaver diversity all over the world, but now we're down to just two species.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The long history involves more diversity, but this is sort of where we're at today.
I have a very early memory of hearing a beaver tail slap
Yeah.
late at night while canoeing in the Adirondacks. So I always thought that they were amazing animals that I had a deep appreciation and respect for. But I didn't quite realize how important they were
Mhm.
until I think it was 2014 or so. I was living in Seattle, and I was looking for things to write about. I was working as a journalist, looking for topics to cover, and somebody forwarded me this flyer, this little email advertisement for a beaver workshop that was happening just outside of Seattle. And I had no idea what a beaver workshop was or what it entailed, but I knew that I wanted to go. So I went to this beaver workshop, and it just completely blew my mind. It was this day-long event where all of these different scientists from various disciplines, ecologists, hydrologists, wildlife biologists, fluvial geomorphologists, all of these different researchers, sort of got up one after another and talked about how important beavers were for sort of solving different kinds of environmental problems. There were
Wow.
talks about beavers and their ability to create salmon habitat, talks about beavers and their ability to store water to help us fight drought and climate change, talks about beavers and wildfire. And it was just completely mind-blowing. So I knew that I had to write about beavers. Washington State, where I live, is sort of I think it's really the national hotbed of beaver-based restoration. You've got so many wonderful beaver projects here. Of course, there's the Tulalip tribe you mentioned, the Methow Beaver Project. There's the Lands Council here in Spokane has a beaver relocation project. The Yakima tribe. There are many that I'm forgetting right now. So there are all of these different groups,
Yeah.
engaged in beaver restoration, and it's really about salmon, right? It's the Northwest is
Right.
it's salmon country, and what do beavers do? Well, beavers, of course, they cut down trees. Here's a nice
Oh, that's great.
beaver chewed wood. They cut down trees, they build dams, and they create ponds and wetlands, right? They create these big deep pools, and those pools are really important habitat for baby salmon, right? If you're a little
Mhm.
finger length salmon, uh, you don't want to live in the main stem fire hose of the river. You're just going to get blown downstream, right? What you want is a nice deep pool or a side channel or a backwater or an eddy. You want some kind of slow water place where you can hang out and take cover from herons and kingfishers and other predators. And beavers, by building these dams and creating these ponds, engineer amazing salmon habitat. And there are lots of great studies basically showing that where you find beaver ponds, you find juvenile salmon. So there's this really wonderful, deep evolutionary connection between these two animals, beavers and salmon. And I think that's driven a lot of the beaver-based restoration in the Northwest, is because salmon are so deeply integral to the culture here, especially native cultures, that restoring beavers is a fantastic mechanism for bringing back these fish that we care about so much.
Because beavers are they're chewing down trees. We all love trees. It looks destructive. They disrupt our own engineering infrastructure in so many ways. So I'm assuming that's at the heart of this long controversy over beavers. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, where do you think things are at? Is there general recognition that on balance, we need to, not only do we need to live with the beavers, but that they're actually beneficial to us in so many ways? Do you think that that's a continuing to evolve in a positive way, that thinking?
I do, definitely. Yeah, it's interesting to think about sort of the history of beavers. Of course, what happened was, as early as the 1600s, these animals were being wiped out by the fur trade, right? There were white trappers and traders from Europe sort of moving westward across the continent, turning beavers into pelts, basically, right? This is a pelt that I bought off a trapper a couple of years ago. What happens when you kill hundreds of millions of beavers? Well, you destroy hundreds of millions of acres of beaver ponds and wetlands, right? These amazing sort of watery habitats that they create. So when we wiped out beavers, we also changed the landscape in ways that we never fully recognized, right? The trappers kind of spread west across the continent, killed all the beavers, and it wasn't really for a few more decades until the farmers and colonists sort of settled those same areas. By the time early naturalists and ecologists were describing North American landscapes, beavers had basically been wiped out, and we sort of lost touch with what these ecosystems are supposed to look like. Right. There are places that today are desert that would have historically been lush marshland, thanks in large part to beavers. So I think that to bring beavers back and to understand how important they are, we have to begin to recognize what a beaver influenced landscape looks like, and how much our ecosystems have changed over time. The fact that a lot of what I talk about in the book is the fact that a lot of our kind of our classic trout streams, these single thread, straight, fast, rocky bottomed, kind of like the kind of stream you would see in a fishing magazine. Right. Historically, those would have been more like swamps, with dead trees everywhere, and and kind of water all over the place, and this thick, sludgy bottom. And that was thanks to beavers. So we've really lost touch, I think, with what our aquatic habitats should look like, or what they did look like when we had beavers in the
when they're supporting a healthy diversity of species.
Yeah, exactly. But but to your point, I think that we're regaining that understanding and recognizing that these are hugely important animals. Of course, they create these amazing habitats for salmon and moose and ducks and frogs, and name a species, and it does well around beavers. But they're also really important for us too, right? We know that the world is getting hotter and drier because of climate change, and beavers are creating these wonderful little reservoirs of water up in the high country that that keep our landscapes hydrated. They're slowing down the spread of wildfire by creating these kind of wetland fire breaks. They're filtering out pollution by slowing the water down and letting nitrogen and phosphorus and other heavy metals sort of settle out of the water column. They're providing all of these incredible services that we're really beginning to understand pretty well. So I do think there's this kind of fantastic beaver movement afoot, especially in the American West. But there are people in Maryland where you are who are doing really great beaver work as well. It's really pretty national and even international. There's a really strong beaver restoration movement in Europe as well. So I do think that beavers in some ways are one of our great conservation success stories.
One of the problems, it seems, with beavers is that they're part of a really dynamic landscape. So what are your thoughts on how we can balance those two things? Like obviously in certain spaces, the way we're using the landscape currently could really actually benefit from beavers, and it should be relatively easy to adapt. But but in lots of landscapes, I mean, you still, when you can't, it's hard to keep a road, for example,
right,
going through some of that territory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think this is probably one of the the ideas that drives the Half Earth Project. But I mean, good beaver habitat and good human habitat are basically one and the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is true of lots of species, right? Where do we build our roads and our farms and our towns? I mean, we build them in these fertile floodplains, along sort of low gradient river valleys, and that's where beavers love to hang out, right? We've kind of claimed a lot of the best habitat as our own. So as beavers recover, they find themselves sort of pressed into conflict with humans.
Yep.
And because they build dams and create these ponds, well, guess what? You don't want a pond covering your farm or your road. So there are lots of beaver conflicts happening all over North America. And those animals are typically branded as the sort of nuisance beavers. I mean, I'd argue that maybe it's us who is sort of the nuisance in a lot of these cases.
Yep.
And the way that those sorts of conflicts are handled is generally by killing the beavers. By trapping out the animal that's causing the problem. And a lot of what I write about in this book, and a lot of what the beaver movement is focused on right now, is figuring out non-lethal ways of handling those problems. How can we say, okay, our infrastructure is in this valley, it's not going anywhere, but we need to get these beavers back so they can create their ponds and wetlands and do their thing. How can we live alongside these animals in a harmonious, successful way? And I think that the kind of the biggest and the best tool in our arsenal for doing that is something called a flow device. You often hear it called a beaver deceiver, and it's basically this pipe and fence system. You pass the pipe through the beaver dam or through a road culvert. The fence is there to kind of prevent the beavers from plugging up the pipe, and the pipe basically creates a leak. Essentially, it just drains. It drains the beaver pond to a level that's acceptable for both parties, the human and the beaver. You can say, hey, I like having the beavers here. I appreciate all the great stuff they do. But I don't want to have to snorkel through my backyard and basically use a flow device to reduce the level of the pond to a height that's acceptable for both of you. So that's moving away from trapping beavers every single time they cause a problem and moving towards these kinds of non-lethal solutions that let the beaver stay on the landscape, like flow devices. I think that's really where the beaver movement is going and has to go.
Yeah. I like that. So a little human engineering to balance with the beaver engineering.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, you do a great job of telling these stories about, some of the inventors of some of these devices, their travails in convincing people that they can maintain them and that they work. No, it's a really great, it's a great cast of characters and all the different ways people have sort of revelations about how they actually, there could be advantages to living with these animals. In the chapter that we're going to share, you've got a couple scientists in there, and there's a fun scene in there where they actually were trying to trap a beaver, but they think they failed. But one of the scientists say, I smell beaver here. And
Right.
in fact, the woman scientist holds her hand up to her friend, her colleague, and says, well, here, smell my hand. Can you sex the beaver from my hand? And of course he gets it. It turns out he gets it wrong. But what's up with that? Tell me about sexing beavers.
Right, right. So one of the things you have to know about beavers is that beavers they have pretty poor eyesight, but they've got amazing senses of smell. They live in these kind of very complex, olfactory worlds, and they've got actually two different sets of scent glands. Their castor sacs and their anal glands, which they use to mark their territories and really send each other pretty complex and sophisticated, sort of chemical messages. For example, a beaver can sniff a scent marking from another beaver and instantly know whether it's related or not. Because they're very territorial animals and they're trying to keep out intruders. And keep their little ponds and wetlands to themselves. So it turns out that one of the things that you can tell when you smell beaver scent is the sex of the animal, which is actually important because you can't look at a beaver and know its sex. Male beavers have internal genitalia, so you can't look at them and see any dangling bits.
Yeah, right. So both sexes have it's internalized. Wow.
Right. So the way that you sex beavers, you have to smell some of its scent secretion, and if it smells like motor oil, it's a male beaver, and if it smells like an old cheese, it's a female beaver, and that sounds highly unscientific, I know, but a good beaver biologist can tell with about 99% accuracy what the sex of an
I
animal
get that from the book, that's just a total standard description. And
Oh yeah, so that's what everybody uses. It's important that we remember that conservation works, right? That we
there's
are
things
capable.
we can do.
Yeah, there are things we can do, I'm always amazed to think that 100 years ago, it would have been hard to see not only a beaver but a black bear or a white-tailed deer or a coyote in North America. Some of our commonest animals were vanishingly rare just a century ago, and we took concrete measures to protect them, and we succeeded in many cases, and beavers are one of those cases. So I think that oftentimes people say, well, what's the point of this work when everything is so dark? And to me, beavers are one of the points of light that we have to keep our eyes fixated on. There are lots and lots of towns all over the country that that have these standing arrangements to trap out beavers whenever they cause problems. And I think that in many cases people don't even recognize that those agreements, those contracts exist. But I do think that it's if you're concerned about beavers, I think that it's worth going to your town council, your county commission, figuring out sort of who is in charge of handling beaver issues in your area, and presenting them with other sort of ways of doing things. There's a really wonderful nonprofit called the Beaver Institute. That's beaverinstitute.org, run by a guy named Mike Callahan, who's a wonderful beaver champion. And they've got all kinds of resources about using flow devices and other non-lethal beaver management measures. So I do think it's worth looking into locally. Who controls the fate of beavers in your community? The most common beaver conflicts, the places where beavers die, are roads, right? Because beavers build dams and road culverts. The water rises and the road gets washed out, so those beavers get trapped out every time they approach the road, basically. So that's an issue where these beavers are being trapped on these public roads that citizens are capable of influencing and are influencing in many cases. in the book, I tell the story of this woman named Heidi Perryman in Martinez, California,
Right, right.
who found out that beavers were going to be trapped in her community, and basically organized this incredible Save the Beavers campaign, including a giant beaver festival that 11 or 12 years later is still going very strong. So there are wonderful examples all over the country of communities learning that their beavers are in danger, and taking really concrete steps to protect them, and succeeding. One of the best things you can do, I mean, some of the happiest times for me are just spent around beaver ponds and wetlands, right? I mean, it's there are these incredible centers of life,
Yeah.
where you can see bald eagles and great blue herons, and and I mean every amphibian you can possibly name. So they're just incredible opportunities to experience a healthy, intact, flourishing ecosystem. So I would really encourage students, especially, to figure out where the beavers are in their community. I mean, these animals are in every single state, besides Hawaii, of course. So there's every opportunity to see them, and figure out where beavers are locally, and and go out there, one night just before dark, and your odds of seeing a beaver are pretty good in a lot of cases,
Yeah.
I would say. What's really cool about beavers is that you can actually, you can really see their signatures using Google Earth, right? You can open up open up Google, find a pond or a wetland, and zoom in, and often you can see the dams, you can see their lodges, you can see the canals they dig. They're actually, I mean, it's amazing. These are animals that change the landscape so dramatically. It's visible from space, right? So that's one of the things that I enjoy doing is looking for beaver infrastructure on Google Earth, and then going out into the field to kind of ground truth it, basically. Are the beavers still there? Are they still active?
Right.
So I think that's a wonderful thing that any beaver interested student or educator could do, is try to figure out where the beavers are in your area, and then go pay them a visit. Working on the next book, which is really another project that is probably up your team's alley. It's about the science of road ecology, basically how roads affect nature,
Oh,
and the sorts of things we can do to reduce that negative impact. So I'm sure that a lot of the viewers out there have seen a picture of the famous wildlife overpasses in Banff. These vegetative strips that allow grizzly bears and elk and wolves to cross the highway. That sort of project. How can we build more of those, and build them better, and basically create landscapes that animals can move through without getting hit by a car. So that's the new project.
thanks again, Ben. Really great conversation, and let's keep in touch.
Yeah, my pleasure, and thank you so much for reading the book and for including me. I really appreciate it, and
Yeah.
we'll be in touch for sure.
Okay, that's great.